All right, let's begin. Let me say at the outset this morning that we're going to talk about privacy today, public figures, private figures. The material that I discussed today will not be on the midterm Thursday. I'll talk a little bit about the midterm at the end of class, but just so you know, while this will be covered in the final, it won't be covered on the midterm. So let me start by raising the issue of privacy. You know, there is, and I've alluded to this earlier in the course, there is a real paradox within American democracy and American society as to what we think about the sort of public nature of our society versus the privacy of individuals within it. And I think in some ways that's really captured in the founding documents. You know, the Declaration of Independence is a consummate public document. It's signed. There are no anonymous sources in the Declaration of Independence. Signed by name. These people were committing effectively treason, and yet they proclaimed their values. And there's a great line at the, there's a transition in the Declaration from the preamble, which is so well known, to the list of grievances against the king that reads, let facts be submitted to a candid world. I mean, that's a nice statement of the value of publicly engaging, in this case, the world. The Constitution also includes a real emphasis on the benefits of an open society. The First Amendment is the one, obviously, which I bring up all the time. It presumes a value of openness. It suggests, not just suggests, it takes for granted that protest is not only important, but needs constitutional protection, that speech, to be able to speak to your leaders, to petition them for your grievances, is a part of the public life of this country. The Sixth Amendment actually uses the word public when it guarantees a speedy and public trial to a criminal defendant. That assumes that a private trial would be dangerous to a defendant, that the government could take action against the defendant that the public wouldn't hold the government accountable for. So the fact that you have a right as a defendant to a public trial is considered part of the protection that you enjoy as an American. And yet those same documents, or at least the Constitution in particular, also presume that there is a value to privacy and that the privacy of an individual is also important to being American. The Third Amendment, which doesn't come up very often in these kinds of discussions, but it prohibits the quartering of soldiers in peacetime. What that means is that the military can't make you put up a soldier in your home. Your home is considered your private place and you have rights to it. The Fourth Amendment, much more specifically, or much more explicitly, protects, as it says, the right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects. This is, again, establishing a kind of zone of privacy around the individual. It says the government, without a warrant, except in the case of the Bush administration and eavesdropping, we've already talked about that, for the most part, the government, without a warrant, can't spy on your conversations, can't enter your home, can't rifle through your papers, as it says. Persons, houses, papers, and effects. That's come to mean phone lines, too, as technology's developed. So there is and has been since the very beginning of this country a tension between the value that we place on the openness of our society and the belief that we have that individuals deserve a privacy and protection of their privacy. It'll come as no surprise to any of you to realize that journalists are right at the middle of that debate. We deal in public information and often deal in the privacy of the individuals we're writing about. Featuring a person in a story in any medium can transform that person's life. It can transform a person who has been up to that point an utterly private and anonymous person for the most part, other than to his or her friends and family, into a person of international renown. That can be for good or for ill. The person can want that transformation, or the person can be mortified by it. But it's a huge power and duty on a journalist to recognize that you have that possibility, that power. And it's important in analyzing that to realize that the Constitution regulates the power of the government, or the actions of the government. It doesn't, for the most part, regulate the powers and authority of the press. But in some cases, the power of the press to intrude on that privacy is just as meaningful or as transformative or as disruptive as the government's power. I mean, let me put it this way. Let's say the government could search your home, or a journalist could search your home. In one case, the government might arrest you for something you had in your home. In the other case, the journalist might expose you to the public for what you had in your home. I don't know what this would be, but just the question is, which one would be more hurtful to you? Arrest or humiliation? both have real consequence. And so any journalist who is weighing the question of how to affect a person's privacy needs to do it with real gravity and really with a full understanding of the ethical implications of that kind of intrusiveness in a person's life. It's also really important in this context to think about the fact that there are dangers on both sides of this, scale. Historically, journalists, and some of this is dealt with in your text, there was a tradition of overprotecting public figures, or what I would argue is overprotecting them. FDR, as you all know, was in a wheelchair. The press made a conscious decision and sort of organized decision not to draw attention to the fact that he was in a wheelchair, that he'd suffered polio. That was done as a matter of deference to him. It was part of the sort of ethos of that period. It was believed that if it couldn't be shown to affect his performance on the job, that no one should talk or write about it. The problem is that by 1944, close to the end of his term, he was desperately sick. He was clearly fading. In fact, he died soon after being re-elected, soon after being re-inaugurated. I think it raises the legitimate question of, had the press reported more assertively, more aggressively on his physical health, he might not have been elected. He might not even have run in '44, and the country might not have been left with a really, traumatic situation of coming to the end of the war and Harry Truman inheriting the presidency. Harry Truman didn't even know about the Manhattan Project. So suddenly you have a new president who is really not versed in the fundamental question of his day, in part at least because the press did not focus on the question of FDR's health. So what was done as a kind of act of deference and respect had real implications, I think, for his presidency, for the country. The more sort of salacious example of this, and slightly more modern times, is Kennedy, who was widely known by many members of the press to be a philanderer. He was cheating on his wife rampantly. Now, some of this, the feeling of the day was that's his private business, notwithstanding the fact that he's the president of the United States, that if we can't show that it affects his performance in office in some way, we shouldn't write about it. Now, some have argued, I don't know if it's true or not, there's really no way to know, but that it subjected him, that it was in fact disruptive business. People were reluctant, his own aides were reluctant to interrupt him when they thought he was with a woman, that it subjected him potentially to blackmail. There are even those Kennedy conspiracy theorists who think it could have contributed to his assassination. I don't, by the way, buy that last one, but in any event, the point is that it's hard to know from the outside whether the private conduct of a public figure is in fact affecting that public figure's work, at least in this case, an elected official. So that's all sort of on the side that says, be careful about withholding information, report aggressively. But there's danger on the other side here too, that salaciously or gratuitously probing into private matters risks debasing journalism. It risks harming people in a kind of psychological way, people who are victims or people who are undergoing a tragedy. It also, I think, arguably has a larger social implication, which is that there are a certain number of people who will not go into public life, whether that's elected office or public life of a university or of civic engagement or whatever, because they're unwilling to undergo that kind of scrutiny, that they feel it's unfair to put their personal lives or the lives of their loved ones or friends or family or whoever into the public discourse as a consequence for them trying to do something in public life. So not saying enough can be a bad thing for society, and saying too much can be a bad thing for society. So as is often the case in this course, what I would sort of urge is a kind of middle course, a thoughtful middle ground that is both conscious of the implications on both sides and also willing to resist doing something just because everyone else does it. And that's a real problem, I think, in modern journalism. They have what we call, often occurs what we refer to as the race to the bottom. That merely because one news organization is willing to do the ghoulish or salacious thing, that everyone else feels like if they don't do it, then competitively they're disadvantaged. I would urge a different way through this, which is to try to make thoughtful decisions and stick with them regardless of what other people do. So let me talk about, there are 4 types of situations. This is kind of a blunt way of dividing this up, but just for the purposes of discussing it today, let me talk about public officials who are engaged in what we would all recognize as public conduct, public officials who are engaged in something that is arguably private conduct, and then private people who are engaged in purely private matters or private people who, for one reason or another, end up being in the public eye. The first two of these are relatively simple, I think, which is to say public figures engaging in public matters and private people who are engaging in purely private conduct. Start with public figures. Public figures who commit a public act deserve our full attention. If Barack Obama delivers a State of the Union address, or Schwarzenegger visits a fire area, or Steve Jobs unveils a new Apple product, or George Clooney attends a movie premiere, these are public people doing public things. They frankly would be more upset if you didn't write about them than if you did. So the question of protecting their privacy, I think, is irrelevant in these. Now, when they do that, though, they do subject themselves to a certain kind of scrutiny. If Barack Obama, in the course of delivering the State of the Union, misstates the federal deficit or goofs up in talking about health care, you have every right, and in fact responsibility, to report on that, to hold him accountable for it. He's engaged in a public act. Same if, and he's the easiest one because that's sort of the consummately public act is to deliver the State of the Union address. But that's no less true if, I didn't watch Steve Jobs' thing with his iPad the other day, but if he'd gone out there and misstated something about that product, and he'd oversold it or lied about it, then you'd have every right as someone covering that, in fact, every responsibility as someone covering that to call him on it. So the mere fact that someone is engaged in a public act doesn't insulate them from scrutiny. In fact, just the opposite. It really means that if you're going to go out there and engage the world, if you're going to go to a movie premiere, it's going to be written about if you trip over the red carpet. I mean, you're out there, and that's fair. And as I say, I don't think anyone would really genuinely dispute that. There is a little twist on this, which is sort of shades away from the sort of purely public nature of it. And that's sort of found in the question of paparazzi. It's easy to hate paparazzi, right? Everyone it's easy, it's sort of cliche almost to hate them. But if you examine it really, what is the act that a paparazzi, a photographer, is doing? They're in a public place, taking a picture of a public person who is also in a public place. It's really hard to see how there is a social objection to that. Now, there's some stuff that paparazzi do that does, and should get them in trouble. If they cause traffic accidents, or they bump into people, or they obstruct sidewalks, that's all, that has to do with the conduct in taking the picture, not the taking of the picture itself. I can't see, though, there's several pieces of legislation, there's been several attempts in the city, for obvious reasons, this has potential implications, or particular implications for LA, just because the movie culture is so based here. But so there have been these pieces of legislation at the city and at the state to try to regulate paparazzi and stop them from taking these pictures. Very hard for me to see. Some of them are just silly attempts to kind of court favor of famous people. But what are you going to do? I mean, realistically, I think it's very hard to write a sensible bill, a sensible law that stops a person from taking a picture in a public place. Now, this could get more complicated. It will get more, it always gets more complicated. Nothing ever gets less complicated. Technology is going to change the way we think about some of these issues. Already it is in the question of photography, which is that, right now you can take, you go to Google Earth, you can see you can see pretty clearly down to a pretty fine level of detail. That's only going to get more so. Satellite imagery is going to get more and more precise. And it is quite conceivable, in fact, it's almost inconceivable to imagine that we won't get to a place where a satellite could take an easily identifiable picture of someone doing something in their backyard. Now, your backyard is a place where you've historically enjoyed a sense of privacy. What happens when someone, already the government can take pictures of you if you have marijuana growing in your backyard, if you have, if there's certain things that could be spotted. But the question is, what happens when that becomes a commercial possibility? Is it going to be okay for, Tabloid to hire satellite time and get a picture of, the backyard of Halle Berry's house and get pictures of her by the pool? Those could be worth some money and would, I think, violate the sense of privacy that we have historically developed that says if you're in your front yard, you're fair game. But if you're in your backyard, you've got some expectation that you're not being spied on. And then, of course, this all breaks down when someone invents the camera that can shoot through the wall. And they can, you know, and I don't know how long is that going to be. One of you will probably invent it, but you know, what happens then? Then is everything off? Is everything a public act? Have we lost any place? And our Constitution, as I read for you earlier, protects you in your person and in your home. What happens when a camera does what the Constitution would prohibit a police officer from doing, which is to enter your home without a permit? That's a hard question to answer, and I think the answer will probably, for journalists, will be found in a set of ethical principles before it's found in a set of legal principles. And I would submit to you, my suggestion for this would be that if people are in a place or committing, you know, or engaged in conduct where they have, the phrase I would use is a reasonable expectation of privacy, then they should enjoy that privacy. If they're sitting in their bedroom, they have every right to think that you as a reporter are not listening in or spying through the window. If you come onto their property and take a picture of them, then I think you violated what is their reasonable expectation of privacy. If they're on the phone in their home, I think they have every reasonable expectation that you will not, you a reporter or any reporter, will not listen in. Now that could be, you know, there are other times when you're on the phone where you might not enjoy that expectation. If you're sitting on an airplane and you're talking on a phone, and there's someone sitting next to you listening, well, tough shit, you know? I mean, I think you really then, you're in play, you know? You're in a public place committing a public act, even though that act is talking on the phone, which doesn't seem that different from talking on the phone in your home. You know, where you are and where a person is and how that person conducts him or herself, I think influences the question of whether ethically they have done something to violate their own privacy. So that all goes to sort of public figures and public acts, and recognizing that the question of paparazzi sort of drifts over into private acts, or what people might say as private acts. Then there's the question of private individuals who are purely engaged in private conduct. If my neighbor is sitting inside his house doing drugs, do I have any right to write about that, you know, or to put that in a publication? Or if my neighbor is collects racist literature, has posters all throughout his house of, you know, Klan rallies, is himself a racist? Does that subject him to public scrutiny? And I guess my answer there would be generally no. That one's purely private beliefs expressed or acted upon in the privacy of one's home, I think, are generally off limits. Now, that could change in a heartbeat. The neighbor who collects racist literature can do so, you know, his whole life without attracting any public notice. As soon as he starts giving money to candidates who, you know, express a racist platform, then he's engaged in a public expression of a private belief. And the donation of money is a public act. If he signs a petition to overturn gay marriage in the state, because he's got homophobic beliefs, well, a petition is a public document, to my view. There's a debate going on about this, by the way. That is, you know, petitioning the government for a change in the law. That as soon as you engage in that, then I think you've put yourself in play, and you have every right to do so. But be careful, because if you're putting yourself in play because you want to act on a certain belief, then those beliefs become subject to scrutiny as well. So the person who really wants their privacy, I think, needs to refrain from certain kinds of public participation. And it may be, by the way, that one act of public participation may not open every aspect of your life to scrutiny. The racist who gives money to the Klan candidate may subject himself to scrutiny of his racial beliefs, but that doesn't mean that his children are now subject to the same scrutiny. It doesn't put every aspect of your life in play necessarily, at least I think ethically. But it may indeed expose that person to more scrutiny, and appropriately so, ethically so. So with that caveat, though, let me just say, in general, I think public people who are engaged in public conduct are completely fair game for scrutiny and analysis, while private people who are minding their own business and only minding their own business are largely off limits. So that leaves the kind of big middle of this. That's the kind of two easier extremes. The big middle of this is private people who, for one reason or another, are thrust into the limelight, and public people who make the case that they ought to enjoy some privacy, that merely being a mayor or a president or a business leader or whatever doesn't mean that every aspect of your life is subject to constant scrutiny. So let me talk first about private people who are in the limelight. By the way, feel free anytime to interrupt with questions or thoughts on any of this. I'm not trying to, please, yeah.
Mine kind of goes back to the paparazzi.
Yeah, please, yeah.
A lot of times you hear situations where paparazzi, because of their conduct, cause a lot of accidents and then report about them. What is the ethics of stuff like that?
I think well, first of all, there's two issues raised by that. One is anytime a reporter creates a story, it creates ethical issues. Now, sometimes those are, and we'll talk about this later in the course, for instance, in the place of Haiti, where some reporters are, in fact, getting involved in the story and helping people. That clearly more defensible than causing an accident. The other issue is that I think the principles that protect paparazzi are First Amendment principles, the right to, take pictures in a public place. The First Amendment does not protect a person, it's not a defense to have caused an accident to say the First Amendment protects me. First Amendment says nothing about causing accidents. So as soon as the paparazzi conduct is different from the paparazzi's right to take the picture. If the paparazzi bumps into you, knocks you over, causes an accident, all of that is not only fair game, but prosecutable under different principles and different laws. It's illegal to cause traffic accidents. So if you do, as far as I'm concerned, go to jail for causing the traffic accident, just not for taking the picture. Yeah.
Do the paparazzi, in your opinion, have a right to take pictures of the kids of celebrities? Like the little 2-year-olds? Does it matter that it's the parents that put them in the limelight?
I think the First Amendment answer is yes. If you're in a public place, anyone has, and when we say paparazzi, by the way, any of you who are walking down the street with your camera or your cell phone or whatever, who sees a famous person can take a picture. If that famous person happens to be with their kids, there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, they may think that there's something wrong with that, but there's no prohibition against you doing it. And if you turn around and sell that to a magazine, there's no violation there either. If you walk onto their property to take that picture, if you cause a traffic accident in the course of taking that picture, those things can get you in trouble. That's trespass and obstruction, all kinds of different things. But no, their children are any more than your children. Or I got a kid. If someone takes this picture in the park, there's nothing I can do about that. If they come to my house to take this picture, there's something I can do about that. Yes.
So, let's say a couple celebrities are having a wedding somewhere, and it's not at their home, and they hire security, and security has to get physical with paparazzi to keep them back. Could they argue that they're they have a First Amendment right to be there, and the security?
Well, it would depend on where it was held, I think. If you hold a wedding on a public beach, you may ask security to try to keep people back, but you have a right to be there. If it's in a park or at a beach or someplace where the paparazzi have the same rights as you or I to walk down the beach, if they happen to be carrying a camera, so be it. On the other hand, you can have a wedding at a church or at a private institution, at a hotel, and those institutions have their rights, and they can ask people. You can't trespass on people's property. So if you're a celebrity having a wedding and you don't want people to take a picture of it, you shouldn't have it at Griffith Park. So there are ways you have it in a private place that has a lot of property, and that you can keep people on the other side of the property and they can't take your picture. Now, as I say, technology changes these things. They could hire a helicopter. They could hire a satellite. There are, as the technology for taking a picture gets better and better, there are fewer and fewer places where you can reasonably enjoy that kind of privacy. But there still are indoor places. Until someone invents the camera that shoots through the wall, you still have that. Yes.
For a non-public figure, just an ordinary girl laying on the beach, if someone walks up to her and starts taking all these digital pictures of her, does she have any grounds to object to that? And
It's a good question. I think probably not would be the answer, in the sense that if you're in a public place, there's I won't tell you the names of the people in this because it was embarrassing to all of them, but I knew someone many years ago who arrived at work one day, and there's one of these pictures on the front page of the paper, the local paper, not our paper, of people out sunbathing in a park. And it was a picture of a man and a woman together, clearly sort of romantic, and it happened to be his wife and another man. This was a startling moment, needless to say. And I had no question but that if she could have not had that picture be in the paper, she would have been happy to not have it there. The fact is, if you go out and you do certain things in public, I think you are in play. And that's unattractive for a lot of people. It's unappealing. But I think, yeah, if a newspaper photographer took your picture on a beach, they can put it in the newspaper. They don't need your permission to do it.
What about even like a non-member of the press, just like a random person just taking a picture?
You're allowed to take pictures of public places, and you can, you can put them on your own website. You can sell it to a newspaper. When people do things in public, they are subject to public scrutiny. Now, if you wanted, again, my answer to that is if you wanted to be outdoors, if you wanted to sunbathe naked, you shouldn't do it in Santa Monica, and you shouldn't do it on the beach. You should do it at home, where you would have a better argument for protection. Now, if a satellite catches your image at home, then that, as I say, begins to get in a kind of a technologically blurry area. But I would argue that if you're in a place where you have a reasonable right to feel that you are private, that the press and other people, private people, shouldn't take a picture either. That's how you protect your privacy. Yes?
Do you know if the same goes for films?
I don't think that there would be any difference between the way film and still photography are treated. They are, the same principle would apply, which is to say if you're in a public place, you're subject to scrutiny. Yes?
Could it also relate to the content though? Is they were doing it with that content, it could be sexual harassment or a whole different.
Certainly, if a photographer, I'm sorry?
To address his question, if it's just a random person who's just taking a lot of pictures of really good content.
I don't think that the picture itself could be construed to be sexual harassment, but if the person were saying something or harassing the person in the course of doing it, obviously, I'm trying to address this as a matter of journalistic ethics, but just as a matter of personal behavior, it's offensive to do that, and you would, at a minimum, you'd want to get away. I don't think, though, the police would arrest a person for doing that. I think, they might try to pull you apart and they might try to cool it down, but I don't think you would be violating the law to take 1,000 pictures of someone on the beach who you just found attractive. You'd be gross and you'd be rude, but, that's that's a sort of a different standard, Yes?
How does this apply to situations where there are private pictures of even regular people, celebrities, that get sold by someone close to them, and that person had the picture, so is that fair game?
Yeah, I think one of the really, and this will come up more and more as phones, have cameras that are more ubiquitous. What happens when you invite friends to your home? Let's assume that you're someone worthy of having your picture taken, that you're a famous person. And you invite friends to your home, and one of your friends takes your picture and then sells it to a tabloid. Well, presumably that's at the cost of your friendship, and they weren't really a friend to begin with. But I don't know whether the person whose picture was taken would really have a case. That's a good question, because then they really would have had a reasonable expectation of privacy. Certainly the friend would have violated it. Whether the publication would have or not, I don't know. I don't know how a court would handle that. It'd be an interesting test case, and I'm sure it's happened. And if it hasn't happened yet, it will in 10 minutes. It's going to happen, Yes?
I can't remember the girl's name, but a while ago there was a girl that died in a car crash, and the police officers took pictures of the car accident and then sold them to...
Oh, uh-huh.
Do you know what I'm talking about?
I don't know that case, although there's a similar case out of San Francisco many years ago of a guy who hadn't died, but who was injured, and he was in I think it was a he, it could have been a woman. He was in a paramedic helicopter, and someone took pictures of him on the stretcher in the helicopter. And that was found to be a violation of his privacy, because it was assumed that inside the medevac unit, or whatever it was called, that he had a reasonable expectation of privacy in there. Now, there is, and this sounds crass, but I'll just say it, dead people have very few rights, so that taking a picture of a person who has died, dead people cannot sue for libel. As far as I know, there are no privacy rights of dead people. What's always hard in a situation like that is that there are live people who cared about the dead person, and it's them who are offended or appalled. There's a picture in the book here of a famous picture of a family that's grieving. It's on page 265 of your book. I don't need to look it up now, but of a family weeping over the body of a boy who died I think he drowned. And they ran the picture in the paper and then wished they hadn't. It used to be, when I started in journalism, it was a pretty strict rule that we didn't run pictures of dead people for just that reason. That has broken down over time, and a lot more organizations will run pictures of bodies. But I don't know the specific case you're talking about.
They sold the pictures to the newspaper, and then those pictures ended up getting used also in schools to try to show the dangers of doing drugs.
Uh-huh.
It was gruesome.
Yeah. Well, I would think most police departments would have a policy against that, even if it weren't, even if the news organizations didn't. I can't imagine that that many police agencies would allow their officers to privately take and sell photos. So I would assume the officer would at least have been disciplined for it.
I think that they all still have their jobs. They all still have their jobs.
They still have their job?
Police officers.
Interesting. Well, then there are some instances where LAPD officers have leaked material to tabloid organizations, presumably for money, and they have actually lost their jobs over it. So different agencies might treat it differently. Was it? That wouldn't be LAPD. That'd be sheriffs. I mean, Malibu is outside the city, but I don't know the case though. It's interesting. I'd look it up. Anyone else? No. Okay. Well, let me go on a little bit. Okay, so we've already sort of dealt with this in some of your questions, but the issue of private people who find their way into the limelight is tricky, and as your questions already indicate. Obviously, we've already talked about one category of these people, and that's crime victims. Most crime victims, the fact of a crime is generally considered a public act, and therefore victims are often publicly identified. Sometimes that can be jarring or disturbing. And we've already talked about the issue of rape victims and whether there's a sort of special category for sexual crimes or sexual assaults. Murder victims are almost always identified. Victims of frauds, I mean, think about the Madoff case from just a couple of years ago. The prominence and the number of the victims of the Madoff fraud is actually what made it such a big story. I mean, in addition to how gigantic the fraud was. But in some ways, I think it made it a much more important story because these were not, easily duped people. These are a lot of smart, investment-savvy people who were fooled by this guy. So the fact, the names and the positions of the victims in Madoff's case are important information. And yet, these are people who did nothing wrong, I mean, other than be conned, and that's not their fault. Suddenly, in fact, the prosecution submitted, as part of a pleading, a list of victims. So not only did they show up in press accounts, but they showed up in government documents. And I'm sure for many of them it was quite upsetting. The sort of preeminent example of this historically, and the one that legal analysts and ethicists often start with, is the one I had you read some about, and I'll just summarize it here, and that has to do with the case of Oliver Sipple. Oliver Sipple, well, first of all, let me just say, this starts September 22nd of 1975. Again, don't worry about the date, but just to set it in time. President Ford was visiting San Francisco. It's actually just not even 3 weeks after he'd visited Sacramento and been the victim of an assassination attempt there. He's coming out of the St. Francis Hotel in San Francisco, and about 3,000 people had gathered to see him. Sipple happened to just be walking by and asked someone in the crowd, what's going on here? And they said, it's President Ford. And so he stopped. Sipple was a Vietnam vet. He'd had a lot of trouble in his life. He was being treated for psychological disabilities at the VA hospital in San Francisco. But as Ford leaves the hotel, Sipple's standing there, and there's a famous picture of this. He looks up and he sees someone pull a gun from her purse or bag of some sort. She raises the pistol, and he reaches forward and bumps her arm. The gun goes off, and then she tries to fire it again, and I think he actually put his thumb in the firing pin and stopped it from going off a second time. The first shot did get fired and caused a huge commotion. It, in fact, it hit someone. It wounded him. It did not kill him. It was a cab driver nearby. As I say, she tried to fire a second time, but he stopped her from doing so, and then they were all just swarmed by Secret Service and others. So Sipple, in effect, saved Ford's life, or quite possibly saved his life. So immediately, he goes from this, sort of troubled Vietnam vet wandering around San Francisco to a figure of national prominence. What was known to many of his friends in San Francisco, but not to his family, was that he was gay. And in the wake of this incident, people who knew him knew this, obviously, and one of the people who knew that was Harvey Milk, the San Francisco supervisor. Milk saw it as an opportunity to draw attention to the fact that there was a gay hero, that this hero who'd done this wonderful thing was gay, and that it was an opportunity to address stereotypes about gays. So he told Herb Caen, who was a columnist for the San Francisco Chronicle, that Sipple was gay, and he suggested to Caen that he could, sort of prove that out himself, if he sent someone, Kane had a staff, this is in the days when columnists had staffs, if he sent someone on his staff to a gay bar in San Francisco called the Red Lantern, he said, I'll bet you Sipple will be there tonight and you can see for yourself. So Kane did that, and the next day his column included this paragraph, which I'll just read to you. It says, one of the heroes of the day, Oliver Billy Sipple, the ex-Marine who grabbed Sarah Jane Moore's arm just as her gun was fired, and thereby may have saved the president's life, was the center of midnight attention at the Red Lantern, a Golden Gate Avenue bar he favors. Wink, wink. The Reverend Ray Broshears, head of Helping Hands Center, and gay politico Harvey Milk, who claimed to be among Sipple's close friends, described themselves as, quote, proud. Maybe this will help break the stereotype. Sipple is among the workers in Milk's campaign for soup. Okay, well, that doesn't quite say that Sipple's gay, but it comes pretty close to saying that he's gay. And it doesn't, you know, this, maybe this will help break the stereotype, clearly refers to the fact that he's gay. Well, as I say, Sipple's friends knew this. This was no secret in San Francisco, but his parents did not know it. And people where he grew up did not know. I think he grew up in Ohio or somewhere in the Midwest. So he sued the Chronicle for $15 million, not arguing that it had libeled him, which is the more, at least especially then, was the more typical way for someone to bring a suit. But to bring a suit for libel, you have to show that something about you hurt your reputation, something that was written about you hurt your reputation and was false. This was not false, this was true. So he sued for invasion of privacy, arguing that it was a true fact, but that it was revealed, that it was a private fact about him, not a public fact. They offered him, actually I think they offered him $100,000 or $150,000 to settle it. He declined. It dragged on for 9 years, and ultimately the Chronicle prevailed entirely. The court ruled that it was impossible to violate the privacy of someone who'd already revealed that fact to hundreds of people. So the question, though, and then Sipple, by the way, goes on to lead a really sad demise in his life. He died, I think it was 1989. He was not even 50 years old. He sort of drunk himself to death. He lay in his apartment for days before anyone found his body. I mean, it's a very sad kind of epilogue to this. But I guess the question that I would pose to all of you, and this is a question that has been asked many times over the years, is was it right for the Chronicle to out him? What do people think? Yeah.
The only thing that I thought was that he was public. Didn't it say there was public acts he did in the gay community?
Yeah, he'd worked for Harvey Milk. As I noted just in the one paragraph, you know, he was a regular at the Red Lantern. I mean, you know, it was not something that he hid from people in San Francisco. The question is whether he's allowed to hide, whether he can be public about something in San Francisco and private about it in Ohio, and does the Chronicle's reporting violate the privacy that he intended to keep with respect to his family? Yeah.
I think ethically they probably shouldn't have, because his homosexuality had nothing to do with saving the president.
No question about it. He did not save the president because he was gay.
They wanted to make him a hero representing gay people, which he was a hero because he saved the president.
Mm-hmm.
So it really had nothing to do, one thing had nothing to do with another.
Mm-hmm.
So if he didn't want to be exposed like that, then they shouldn't have done it.
What about the fact that he was a veteran or a Marine? Are those relevant?
Bring that up. I mean, that's kind of relevant, I guess. But I mean, the fact is that just because he chose to sleep with men doesn't have any bearing on the story. It was still a story without him being gay.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think what Milk would say, for instance, to that is that, and whether Milk had the right to make this decision for him is another issue in all of this, but would say that this is a time where it was terribly easy to stereotype gays, and there were few heroic acts that Milk could point to of sort of living gay people, and here was a chance to make a statement on behalf of gays that was only good for society. I mean, that would be, I'm putting words in his mouth, obviously, because I didn't ever talk to Milk about it, but I suspect that would be his answer. Yes?
I think it would have worked better for them if they had presented it more of like an interview, like if they had come in and said, well, we've heard this about you.
Mm-hmm. Interesting.
We've heard that, this is what your personal life is like, and we want to do a story talking about how you are a hero to the gay community, and would you like And that way, they could have at least heard from him that, no, I'm not okay with this. There are people
Right.
out there that I don't want knowing about it.
That's sort of like the rape victim question, that if the rape victim gives permission to use usually her name, that changes the ethical equation. And you're right, I actually don't know whether they tried to. I think that's a good question. I don't know historically whether that's the case, yeah.
I agree with him and how you were saying, well, milk thought it would be best for society. I mean, he really, he doesn't have to do what's best for society.
It's not his obligation.
He doesn't need to be portrayed as a gay hero if he doesn't want to be, and I feel like they violated. That's a very personal part of someone's life, their sexuality, and something, even if they do share it with certain people, it should be their choice whether or not they want to share it with the entire world.
And let me ask you this, just to push back on that a little. The fact that he's, in a bar the next night, people are buying him drinks, it's a gay bar, there's people presumably are talking there in a relatively public place about the fact that he's gay. So it didn't require sneaking into his bedroom to discover that he was gay. No one took a picture through his window. No one did what we would consider a sort of a trespass or violative in that way. Has he in effect made it public by treating it so publicly?
Yeah, I just think it's irrelevant to the story, and he's not otherwise any type of public official, so.
There's no doubt about that.
It doesn't really, even though he is kind of making it public in that sort of sense, there's still people that wouldn't know about it if they didn't read the story, and so I feel like he's not a public official, he's still a private individual who has just committed a heroic act, and so it doesn't need to be subject.
Yeah, that's what makes this case so poignant, is that not only was he, it's hard when you have victims who are certainly thrust in the limelight, but this is someone who actually did something heroic, so it seems like a high price to pay for doing a good thing. Yes?
I think that I see where the arguments are coming from and stuff, but regardless of whether it's relevant to any heroic act that he did, I think the simple fact that he was in a public place and he didn't care to make it a point to hide that he was gay puts him in fair game to expose his sexuality.
That's certainly what the court ruled, yes.
I understand why Harvey Milk wanted to say that he was gay, because it does put that gay community in a positive light. But I feel like he did more damage than good, because the fact that he went against the article and wanted to say hey, this is an invasion of privacy, kind of puts it in a negative light. I didn't want that I was gay out there, and so it kind of makes it a bad thing that it's out there. So I feel like it kind of did more damage to the community than any good.
What if Milk didn't know that he kept this? And I don't know, by the way, whether Milk knew this was a secret he was keeping from his family. But what if he might have had every right to assume that this person seemed so utterly public to him that he didn't have any reason. Now, granted, people tended to be more private about this in 1975 than today. But would that change your analysis at all?
Well, right now I have a lot of gay friends, and I know that regardless of how many years they've been out, it's still a sensitive subject. And given that Harvey Milk was gay himself, he should have been more sensitive to that. And I understand why he wanted to put it out there, but I think that he should have gotten consent first and talked to him before it was publicly announced that he was gay.
Okay. 1 sec, I'll be right back to you. Let me go to the back first, yes.
I think just on the side of the press, I think it's kind of a high expectation to say, oh, I'm going to be out in this area and not out in other areas. I think there obviously was discrepancy whether the ethics of Harvey Milk and his ability to be able to out him that way. But if you're going to be out in one area, you can't say, oh, I'm only out in San Francisco. I'm sorry. You know what I mean? That's something that you kind of personally have to deal with.
This goes a little off the point in some ways, but the other thing I think to think about, not necessarily as a matter of journalism or even of ethics of this, but just of culture and history, is that this was a point in time where people who were gay came to San Francisco specifically to be out in San Francisco. San Francisco enjoyed a sort of special status in the kind of life of the gay community. That said, I certainly endorse your point. It's very hard to be sort of geographically selective about your identity. Less so today than in those days, but even in those days. And that's certainly part of what the court concluded.
As a newspaper, I don't see any issue with it, just because there's no way for the newspaper to know, oh, he has family in Ohio, that might not be okay with this. He's presenting himself as person, he can't, like, I think it's a very high expectation to place that everybody will understand that he's only this person here.
Right.
When you only know him as this person. Like,
Yeah.
Ethically, I don't really have issue with them reporting the bar that he frequents, or even interviewing a known friend of his and taking a quote from him. What I do think is an ethical issue is for Harvey Milk and the paper to reach or have some sort of agreement for him to be a poster boy for, you know, whatever they think he should be without really consulting them.
Yeah, I mean, agreement may be a bit strong, but yeah, I mean, Milk obviously was acting in his own interests here, which is to, I mean, not his personal interest so much as his political, philosophical interests. I mean, you know, in the end, all Milk really does, as far as I know, is say, if you show up at this bar at this time, you'll learn something about this guy. Now, he probably went further and told them what they would learn. In fact, his quote, the fact that it helped break the stereotype, really indicates where his motive is in all of this. But, you know, let's imagine for a minute, let's take Milk out of it for a second. What if a reporter, one of Herb Cain's staff, just happened to be in the bar when this happened? Let's imagine that there wasn't, you know, then that clears the issue for you.
The only issue that I have is that they didn't ask them about that.
Got it. Somewhere, yes. Yeah, yes.
I was just gonna say that there's probably a reason he came out to San Francisco to be gay, because maybe his family doesn't accept him. And there's a lot of families out there, parents, etc., that are not okay with it and like will freak out, and that could cause psychological problems for him. He already had them in the first place, which could have caused more grief. And that's probably a reason he moved out there specifically for that. And maybe the agreement thing would have been better. I don't know, to ask him, like, you know, why is it that you were just here being like this, or are you, like, does everybody know about it?
Yeah, and I think, by the way, all of that is true. I think that's precisely, I mean, his family didn't know about it, wasn't happy about it. Ultimately, I think did sort of come around, but at first blush, you know, they learned about it from the newspaper, from the press. And I think it was, I know it was startling to them, and they were unhappy about it. So presumably that's why he was there. It's a tough way to find out. Right, exactly. Even if it's something, by the way, that you don't have a philosophical or moral or other problem with, it's tough to learn something about your kid from the newspaper.
They've been hiding from you.
Right, exactly, right. Yes.
Okay, but at the same time, like in the story he talks about, he was out in New York, he was out in Florida, he was out in San Francisco. I mean, it wasn't just San Francisco, that was
True.
his safe haven. He was living with a guy in
He lived with someone?
New York and then moved with them to Miami. I mean, this wasn't an isolated place where he was out. I mean, anyone, you could have gone to New York and been like, did you know Sipple? And they'd be like, yeah, he's gay. I mean,
This was an easily discoverable fact, yes.
easily discoverable, and he was like admitting it in a public place in multiple cities. I mean, yeah, it's bad that his family found out in the newspaper, but was it public domain? Yeah, it was.
Again, the court certainly agreed, yes.
Okay, but at the end of the day, who cares? I know Harvey Milk did because he wanted to make an example of him because he was homosexual, but at the same time, it's like, how was it relevant to what he did? Him being a veteran was relevant because he could have...
Because of a gun,
yeah,
experience with guns.
Yeah, but the fact that they had to put, I mean, if he had been heterosexual, would they have like put that as the front, that he was heterosexual?
What if he'd been a Democrat? I mean, I don't know what his politics were, but a Democrat who saved a Republican president. Or, I mean, how close does the relevance have to be for it to be, and you don't want that known, that you're entitled to it.
You were saying that when a private figure engages in a public act, it doesn't mean that every area of their life is going to come under scrutiny. I think his sexual orientation had nothing to do with what he did, and to enter that into it was ridiculous.
He also had been treated, for instance, for psychological troubles. If they had reported that, everyone would recognize the potential harm in that,
But that's
and yet.
medical history. That's not the same thing. I mean, you expect a doctor or patient privilege with your medical history.
Right, although friends may have known that too. I mean, you're right, the doctor wouldn't have any right to reveal it, but if he had talked to friends about it, certainly that would be possibly a discoverable fact, maybe not quite as discoverable as his sexual identity, but one that reporters might have gotten and that might have been interesting to the story, and yet would have presumably been hurtful to him to have disclosed. Yeah.
Whoever the guy was down there that said the ethical issue lies with Milk, and I think that's the problem because, like you said, he didn't inject himself into the public discourse I think, really willingly. You know what I mean? It was
No
more of a
question.
reaction. And what Harvey Milk did was he made him a political figure. So I think that's wrong, and I think as a journalist you have to make that decision. No, you didn't obviously legally do anything wrong, but at the same time I kind of would have thought twice about it, you know. And the suggestion too that there should have been an interview, should have been a discussion. I just think it's the right way to do it.
Yeah, I wish I knew whether they had asked. I mean, I don't know what the piece of that history is, whether in the bar that night, where the person said, do you have any problem?
I mean, we're in college. I mean, geographically, I think a lot of people do things here that they wouldn't do at home.
Anyone want to talk? No.
It's fine now.
Right.
Obviously, it may not be quite as big of a deal because
Right.
there's something serious with a lot of negative social stigma about it that people have to, deal with and negotiate. But
And you certainly don't want a situation where you're reluctant to save the life of the president for fear that something you're doing at college will get back to your parents, I mean, so there is a kind of larger social construct here, too, yeah. Yes, in the back.
Yeah, I understand what everyone's saying about the fact that, in general, he was a private figure, but at the same time, we forget that it was a true fact. It wasn't something that was made up.
This is true.
And so technically, he was lying to his family by, presenting this image that he was heterosexual, when in reality, if you had reported that he had brown hair or whatever his demographic or whatever physical attributes were, that's true. The truth of the matter is he is gay, so he technically lied to his family, and that was the falsehood right there. So.
Yeah, it is an odd situation where, as I pointed out at the outset, this is not a libel suit. There is no allegation that anything in this is false. It is just, in fact, libel and privacy are almost opposite notions, because you cannot bring a privacy claim if someone reports something false about you, because it's not an invasion of your privacy, and you can't bring a libel claim if someone tells something true about you, because then there's no falsehood. Let's take just one or two more on this, because I do want to get to others, but yeah, go ahead.
But with respect to his family, you don't know if he was lying to them or not. There might have been an unsaid thing where they just didn't talk about it, they didn't ask questions.
True enough.
So
There's something implicitly, I mean, the fact that they discovered it from the news coverage and that they were shocked about it suggests that they at least had a misunderstanding, but you're right, we have no insight into what they were said, right? Yeah, last one, yeah.
I have a hard time likening it to his physical appearance, because that's something that you see. Like, I can't just look at somebody and say you're gay or you're straight. Like, you shouldn't do that. And so I think that the fault lies, like you said there, in the source. And the reporter should have thought about the source's motivations behind it and whether or not that affected.
Right, and I need to cut this off just so we can do a couple other examples, but I do, imagine, for instance, that someone saved Obama's life in a situation like this, and it turned out that that person was a racist. I mean, it would be too delicious not to report. The irony of it would be so overwhelming, it would be extremely hard not to report it. And yet, that would potentially be very hurtful to that person to have that fact, as I discussed at the outset, someone who privately harbors racist views or collects racist literature and does so in their own home, I think is sort of off limits. If that person saves the life of the president, does that become a relevant fact in the coverage? That's a hard one, and I would be willing to bet it would not stay private for long, but it would be a tough call. All right, let me move on. I know you all have more thoughts on this, but I have a couple examples in the fourth category here, and in some ways is the one that's most familiar to all of us, which is the question of, is there some zone of privacy around even the most public figure? In other words, this falls in the category of public figures in what are arguably private acts. And so let me cite a couple examples here that are well known to all of you. The preeminent one in this field would be Clinton and Lewinsky. All right, you know the background, so I'll do it very quickly. But Bill Clinton, when he ran for president, long been accused or suspected of having extramarital affairs. After being elected, he was sued in 1994 by Paula Jones, who had been an Arkansas state employee who argued in her lawsuit that she'd been sexually harassed by Clinton when he was governor. The first question in this lawsuit was whether a sitting president could be sued by a private litigant. And Clinton's argument was no, that this whole thing had to be told until after his presidency. It took years for that to sort of bubble its way all the way through the courts. In 1997, the Supreme Court unanimously ruled that he could, in fact, that a president could be sued by a private litigant. Once the Jones and her attorneys had that ruling, they proceeded to question the president, both in depositions and in what are called interrogatories, which are written questions posed to a defendant. He was asked in December of 1997, in a written interrogatory, he was asked to name all the women in state or federal employment with whom he had had sexual relations. His answer was none. Skip forward a few weeks. In January of 1998, he was deposed, and he was asked specifically about Monica Lewinsky. He denied having a sexual relationship, sexual affairs, or sexual relations with her. About the same time, a friend of Lewinsky's, Linda Tripp, reports to the special prosecutor that she believes that if questioned, that Lewinsky will lie, and that Lewinsky is urging other people to lie to cover up her relationship with the president. Anyway, long story short, Kenneth Starr, the special prosecutor, who had initially been brought in, by the way, had nothing to do with the president's sexual habits, had to do with the Rose Hills law firm and some allegations of misconduct going back into the Arkansas days. He concluded that Clinton had lied when he was asked about Lewinsky. Clinton, on a very technical basis, argued that he had not lied, and it's a technical and salacious basis. But it is. I reread the Starr report a month or so ago, and it still makes me kind of sweat to read it. Again, you know the outcome here. Clinton was impeached for what was said to be an act of perjury. He was tried in the Senate, big hoopla, and he was acquitted, and he left with higher approval ratings than ever. So exactly what lesson we're supposed to derive from this is very unclear to me. But we went through a national convulsion, a real separation of powers issue, a real test of constitutional principles over 10 kind of abbreviated sexual acts between a president and an intern. I don't think it's possible to argue that this is not a story. I mean, there was an impeachment of a president of the United States and all of it. But the question is there any argument for a public official of that stature, which is to say the ultimate public official, enjoying some zone of privacy? There's no allegation that he did anything illegal. Well, there's an allegation that he lied about this, and there's the perjury issue. But assume that away for a minute. Let's assume that's not part of the Clinton case. Is it a story if the president has this, I don't even know what to describe his relationship with Lewinsky as, but the relationship that he had with Lewinsky, is that a story? Yeah.
I have a question. Isn't he under trial for something illegal for sexual harassment?
The other interesting thing is that Paula Jones' case ultimately was dismissed. It's only in the course of, they put him, the Jones lawyers, there was a highly political lawsuit against him. It wasn't just a sexual harassment case, it was a political case too. But yes, the reason that they got to ask about Lewinsky is they got to ask him, they got to explore the question of whether he was in the habit, basically, of harassing federal or state employees. And so because she was a federal employee at the time of their relationship as an intern in the White House, it was relevant for them, it was ruled relevant for them to ask the question about her. And then the question becomes, does he lie about that? So the perjury doesn't arise with respect to Jones specifically, but it arises out of the Jones case. Anyone? Yeah.
I think the people that we elect and choose to represent us and lead our country and make important decisions, I think we expect them to have a high level of morality and stuff. And if he's participating in action like that, we have to question kind of what kind of person he is and what else he would do that we would kind of consider that wasn't really okay. So I think
character. The question of what the character of elected leaders. I think that's a sort of classic response on these is the question, and that's the argument for the most expansive reporting on public officials. Is there any limit to that? Is there any bad act that a public official could commit that would be considered private in that view, in your view, if all character is relevant?
When I think of it right now, no.
Mm-hmm. So that's really open season then on them. I happen to be sort of with you on this, but that's not the issue. Yeah, hold on, I'll get back to you. Yeah.
I think there's a bit of a difference. I think this John Edwards situation.
Right, another good example.
Consuming it would have affected his ability to lead, his decision making, all that kind of stuff. I guess you can't make that distinction, so I kind of agree with you, but I think it's unfortunate, because I don't think, I mean, Bill Clinton, they call it air fuck one for a reason. All these things.
I never heard that.
In fact, it didn't affect his ability to lead. Someone like John Edwards, and it became like a psychological issue, I think it's different, but unfortunately, I don't think we can make that distinction.
Yeah, let's imagine, I mean, the Edwards thing obviously escaped a lot of notice, although it sort of squeaked out over the course of the months. But imagine that John Edwards had won. And then this baby was revealed to be the baby of the President of the United States. That's a hell of a piece of work, you know?
The line, they're trying to trade, like, this whole thing with the bombing and getting in and blah, blah, it's crazy.
I mean, right, the recklessness that's at evidence there. And that is where, by the way, on the character side of this, that's what I would identify as the fundamental issue in the Edwards case, is the fact that he ran for president, trying to become president, knowing that if he became president that this was sitting there quite close to the sidelines, is a pretty intense act of hubris. Yes?
Clinton's discretion, I don't feel impeded his ability to lead. Like, he had higher approval ratings than ever. But I think it's worthy of being reported on. But then I see a bigger issue with those politicians who pass, like, anti-gay legislation and then, like, solicit men in airport bathrooms. Like, that's a big
Okay,
problem.
let me ask you a question on that. Using that example, let's say if the issue is always hypocrisy, which is really what you put your finger on, so that the anti-gay politician who's secretly gay, or the anti-drug politician who's doing drugs, or whatever the hypocrisy is, does that mean that gay politicians who support gay rights get to keep it a secret, but gay politicians who don't support gay rights are subject to being outed? I mean, that creates an odd, I can't imagine, but people will do the strangest things, No, that's a good point. It probably wouldn't arise too often, but it might. I mean, there are plenty of people there's some gay politicians who, for instance, don't support gay marriage. I mean, does that say that we're going to protect certain kinds of gay politicians from being outed and not others, based on their political views?
I kind of think if you're in that position, you're going to be outed, and you kind of deserve to know.
And you just, right, okay. Who else? Yeah, I promised to go back to you, right?
I think, especially when it comes to the president, it's kind of a different situation. Almost everything in their life is private. Public. They're living in a public facility.
It's public housing. Yeah.
You're saying their own home is private. This isn't their own home anymore. They're in a position that's completely public.
Right.
Their job is 24/7. Like, he's having an affair with someone who works for the government that's inner office, that's public again. Like, I feel like the president in their position, everything is public.
So what if this were a prominent business leader? I don't want to use a name because I wouldn't want it attached to this example, but a prominent business leader or a university president or a member of Congress raises some of the same issues. But in other words, a person who is of public prominence, if it's a university president, might even be someone who's receiving public money for their job. Let's say it's a university president and it happens in the office of the president of the university, a public facility. And yet, what I'm trying to do, I guess, is strip down the fame of the person involved, but retain some of the other things that make it a public act. If the president of a university engaged in the same conduct, would it be a story?
I think president of a university, yes. Prominent businessman, no.
Really? Where's the distinction there?
Line, but I think different jobs is more public, especially when it comes to government jobs where it's our tax money paying these people. And
that's always a dividing point, right?
I mean, it's a tough situation, I think, but I think, like, public university, if it's on a school campus, a lot of parents would be like, my students are there type thing. It's a lot different with, that's not really necessarily as much of a choice as working for someone in a big industry. Like, yes, like what they're doing, if it's something happens. I mean,
Is there a difference between a private university and a public university? I mean, can presidents of private colleges harass more willingly than those of public universities? I mean, I think you may be about to paint yourself into a corner.
I
Very good. Yes?
I think it's interesting because, and I know this is the law,
side of things, but the test was originally just public officials for
Mhm.
actual malice
Right.
negligence in terms of fault, but then it was extended to public figures. And so they were saying even like, so let's say obviously Steve Jobs would be a huge name in the business
Right.
world.
Bigger than most people in Congress, for instance.
Right, exactly. But even if you were like a local person who was famous locally for what you did in your business, you'd still have to prove actual malice because you're then a public figure technically.
Agreed. I guess I'm not really asking the libel question so much, although it helps to sort of frame the issue. So much as I'm asking is there a person who's of sufficiently low profile or sufficiently sort of out? I mean, we're agreeing that the president is kind of the ultimate public figure, public official, everything. Is the conduct that Clinton engaged in such a story that it would apply even if this person weren't as big a public official or public figure, if it were a prominent business person, or if it were, you know, the head of the local Boy Scouts, or if it were the, you know, publisher of the Los Angeles Times, God forbid. You know, I mean, at what point does the person become of sufficiently low profile that this doesn't become a story, I guess is the...
I think as long as you have a title, it makes it interesting for people to read. That's an issue.
That's good.
You know what I mean?
So avoid titles, I guess is the law. Right. Very good. Let me do one more, and then I want to talk a little about the midterm. Yeah, please.
Well, just like on the titles and everything, I think that it is pertinent for people to know, because if you have a title, it's very likely that people will respect you, look up to you, and have faith in some credibility. If you lie to alter, you're just as likely to lie in something else. So the fact that you can justify or rationalize things to yourself / act in self-interest to that extent, I think that really speaks.
And again, I want to cut this off because I need to talk a little bit more, but what about cultural figures as opposed to political? For instance, and I was one of my examples, and we won't get to it today, but Arnold Schwarzenegger, who, you know, there's much written about him at a time when I was not at the paper, actually, but much written about him in the recall campaign about whether he had groped women. But the groping that is said to have occurred while he was an actor, not while he was a candidate for governor, but it surfaced in the context of his candidate for governor. Does that change the equation if he doesn't hold a public office or isn't? I mean, he was a public figure, he was an internationally known person, but not one with any public responsibilities when this is said to have happened. Does that change how accountable he should be for?
I think that the fact that he's capable, that people don't change in a heartbeat second. I mean, maybe it'd be great if they did.
Don't know, yeah.
Say their vow, they could all of a sudden, stop any of that type of behavior. But in general, people are, creatures of pattern, repetition. He got away with it before. Again, let's say he cheated on his wife before.
Right, don't know.
I think that it lessens that.
I mean, that really goes back to your character point. I mean, that we tend to see character is not exactly frozen in time, but not susceptible to sort of quick switches, that one's character is so fundamental to them that if they'll engage in this kind of bad act or this line or this misrepresentation, that they're likely to do it in another position as well. And that makes it, under that theory, a lot of stuff that we might be squeamish about gets into the newspaper. I mean, because it really allows for a pretty broad, expansive definition that protects aggressive reporting. Okay, well, I had a couple more salacious examples, but they'll wait for another day. All right, let me talk a little bit about the midterm.